Hello there. Wait, wrong character. Ah, there we go. So, Mace Windus is a badass, no question. One of the only Jedi to defeat Palpatine.
Well, all the Jedi have beaten Palpatine technically.
Okay, one of the only Jedi to beat Palpatine in a way that makes satisfying sense. But how did he do it? If you're anything more than a casual fan, you might have heard the word Vaapad.
Possibly.
And if you're an even more dedicated Star Wars fan, you'll know it was the reason Mace was able to toe-to-toe with the Dark Lord of the Sith. But what is it? How does it work? And are there any Sith who can overcome this dark side kryptonite? Never fear, we here at the Fandom who meticulously research our videos.
Ah, great. Liam, have you got the source for the cross-guard video yet?
Shh, not now, Tom. Are here to bring you the rundown. Now, Disney hasn't fleshed out Vaapad to any extreme extent, other than to say it's a lightsaber form Mace created, it feeds off of emotions, and it's the reason he defeated Sidious.
You have lost.
So, full disclosure, we're going to be using Legends information because it still kind of fits, and let's be honest, it's far more interesting. Also, please note that while Vaapad is pretty fleshed out in the Legends lore, its more interesting elements are still open to a little interpretation. So if you disagree with our take, politely tell us why in the comments. If you disagree with someone else in the comments, politely tell them why. We wish for this channel to be a that guy free zone.
We went into aggressive negotiations, thank you.
Aggressive negotiations, what's that?
Well, negotiations with a lightsaber.
Now, it is accurate to say Vaapad is a lightsaber form. It was created by Mace to help him channel his own aggression into something more positive. It builds off of the back of Form 7 Juyo, which utilizes ferocious staccato-style attacks to aggressively overpower your opponent. There's very little defense involved, you're essentially countering your opponent's offense with your own offense. It's not a form favored by most Jedi for obvious reasons, and tends to be studied by the Sith, again for obvious reasons. Vaapad takes this form and refines it to its most effective moves and techniques, stripping away the more eccentric elements to perfect the practical. What you're left with is a style that, much like Mace himself, just gets to the point. Because of the stripping away of the more flashy and flowy elements, an ill-informed observer would say Vaapad looks very unpolished and kind of sloppy, due to the attacks not appearing interconnected to one another. This couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, the form is highly precise and focused, and purposely leveraging unpredictability with its staggered attacks and sudden changes in direction. In fact, the changes in direction and attack vector are so bloody quick, random, and unpredictable that to less skilled opponents it often felt like they were facing 8 different lightsaber blades at once. So that's the lightsaber form element to it. Pretty cool, eh? But that's not what makes Vaapad into Sith kryptonite. We're still missing the more important half. The other half of the form is best described as a state of mind, or if you've played KOTOR 2, a force form. Now, this is the nitty-gritty of Vaapad, and what makes it dark side repellent bat spray. It's also what makes the form so dangerous, not just for the unlucky Sith on the receiving end, but for the one employing it. Mace Windus, at least in Legends, was the only Jedi to ever successfully employ Vaapad. Everyone else who studied it fell to the dark side to varying degrees of severity. For Vaapad to truly work in its entirety, it's not just enough to learn the katas, techniques, and blade work. You've also got to learn how to enjoy fighting, to open yourself up to the dark side, but without also giving in to the hatred and aggression that's often involved with this. When Mace fights an opponent who is channeling the dark side, he allows himself to enjoy the contest. In doing so, he opens himself up to his opponent within the Force, accepting their anger, hatred, fear, and power in the dark side, and using it as a sort of amplifier to his own base power. And yes, you heard that right. Fear is an emotion Sith feel and use. All those who have power fear losing it, including dark side demigods. You'll notice I've said accept and not absorb, and that might sound like it's splitting hairs, but it's an incredibly significant distinction that determines whether or not you're one with Vaapad, or you've regressed back to Juyo, and more often than not, allowed the dark side to corrupt you. What makes Vaapad distinct from Juyo is while it utilizes aggression, the user must not allow the dark side energy to touch and corrupt them, and must stay firmly rooted in harmony with the Force. But Obviously, you can't do that if you're accepting and opening yourself up to your opponent's anger, fear, hatred, basically skirting within a hair's breadth of the dark side, can you? Well, here's what makes Vaapad so damn lethal to Sith. Mace might accept this dark power from his opponent and use it to amp himself up, but no one ever said he had to hold on to it, did they? So where does it go? Through sheer discipline and focus, Mace redirects his opponent's dark side power straight back into his opponent's face. Quite literally in Palpatine's case. Mace is pretty much playing hot potato with the dark side. This is actually why Palpatine's lightning was returned to sender when thrown at Mace's lightsaber, whereas Obi-Wan could only merely use his saber as a lightning rod to absorb Dooku's bolts. This redirecting of his opponent's own dark side power allows Mace to either quickly overpower his opponent, or, if he was vastly outmatched in the first place, like was the case with Sidious, put him on a level playing field, and cause the start of a chain reaction. You see, Vaapad is not a static one-use trick, it's a continuous ramping loop, and it's actually the Darksider who creates this loop, and their own undoing. Imagine you're a typical Sith, throwing your anger, hatred, and all the other emotions you use to fuel your offense, working yourself into a whirlwind of unbridled rage and fury in pursuit of the singular goal of killing your opponent, only for your opponent to stonewall you, then add insult to injury by flinging your own fury, rage, and power back at you, while simultaneously remaining anger and corruption free. Flustered, and in an ever state of blinding rage and ever-mounting frustration at being unable to kill this smug mofo, are you going to A. Calm down, get a hold over your emotions, and begin to fight in a measured and controlled fashion? B. Pour in more anger, more hatred, and fuel the fires of the dark side within you even more, and hope it eventually overpowers your opponent? If you chose A, well done, you have a keen logical mind and might stand a chance. And if you chose B, you are 99.9999999% of all Sith. If a Darkside user allows Mace even a moment to get into the Vaapad state of mind, the fight becomes pretty much unwinnable for them. At least when considering lightsaber dueling. Now, we're not getting into an argument here about whether or not Sidious threw the fight, or Mace genuinely won. Because, spoiler alert, me and Tom disagree about it. And we'd also like to keep this roundtable discussion relevant to Sith who can overcome Vaapad. Anyway, this is why the fight was hopeless for Sidious. Even if you want to argue that he purposely threw the fight, which even I can admit as a die-hard Mace won fair and square fan, is a possibility. It wasn't thrown because Sidious could win at any time. In fact, quite the opposite. It was thrown because it became impossible for Sidious to win once Mace got going. Imagine a universe where Anakin couldn't possibly show up. How would the fight have played out? Well, assuming Sidious couldn't cut Mace down in less than a second, Mace would have likely slipped into the Vaapad mindset and brickwalled Sidious, causing Sidious to pour in more anger, more hatred, only for Mace to reflect it back into his face. If Mace keeps looping and Sidious keeps pouring, the end result can only be Sidious eventually calling upon too much Darkside power for his old, frail body to handle, and he quite literally explodes with energy like a Darkside-filled balloon. Now we know the dark side is harmful to the living, and it takes a toll on the user. This is why Sith have glowing yellow eyes and generally look like they need to be hooked up to a life support machine. In the old lore, it was known as dark side degradation, which leads me to logically believe that even Sith as powerful as Sidious have a finite amount of dark side energy they can embody before their physical form fails. Now, as we've stated, Mace doesn't absorb the dark side or let it touch him. All that energy is focused back to the sender. Whether or not Mace survives the explosion is up for debate. So that's how Vaapad works. It's a tall mountain for any Sith to overcome. Not just Sith, but any Darkside user that unleashes their fury like Sidious, Maul, Bane, Malgus, as powerful as they are, have little to no chance of overcoming the baddest mofo in the galaxy. Well, if they're stupid enough to try and cross blades at least. But are there any Sith or Darksiders who can? Believe it or not, I think there is. There is no counter to the lightsaber form itself. You've got some pretty deft blade work to deal with regardless of how you fight. So high levels of skill with a lightsaber form that focuses on blade-to-blade combat is a prerequisite no matter what, if you want to win. And not just escape like a sniveling coward. But the state of mind aspect of Vaapad can be nullified. There are two halves to the mirror/looping element. Starve one half of what it needs to get going, and Mace has no amp.
Who form a symbiont circle. What happens to one of you will affect the other. You must understand this.
Though that doesn't mean you're out of the woods. He's still unbelievably powerful even without his clever trick, second only really to Yoda and possibly Anakin among the Jedi. So how do you starve the loop? Well, again, speculation and theory time here, but it would make logical sense to assume that if fury, anger, hatred and fear, and all those other dark side emotions feed the fire, remaining calm, focused, and keeping your emotions in check while dueling would be nothing short of a wet blanket. Mace can still relish and enjoy the fight himself, but without you reciprocating, there's nothing for him to redirect back at you. Now, calmness and level-headedness are not often words you associate with the Sith, but there are black sheep among the Order who chose a different tact in combat that might just give them a chance. So who makes this prestigious cut? Our first pick, and the one who we think can actually win, is none other than Sidious' own apprentice, Count Dooku. Dooku is an absolute force to be reckoned with, even in his old age. Based purely on technical skill and discounting the boost from the Force, Dooku is perhaps the greatest lightsaber duelist of his day. Specializing in Form 2 Makashi, a form dedicated to nothing else but lightsaber dueling, Dooku didn't just master this form, he innovated it, much in the same way Mace innovated Form 7, figuring out the weaknesses and shortcomings of the form and developing methods for nullifying them. But what gives this distinguished gentleman a dog in the fight against his old friend is his mentality in combat. Dooku was a firm believer in the execution of refined technique coupled with spontaneous capitalization of opportunity in the moment, over wildly flailing at your opponent trying to bash through them. Looking at you, Sidious. Notice when he duels, he doesn't cackle or turn into a berserker trying to hammer his opponent into submission. He's calm, collected, and fighting with a detached, pragmatic ruthlessness. In other words, unlike most Sith, he keeps his emotions in check and relies on staying focused, looking for small chinks in his opponent's defenses that he can exploit. He doesn't really call on the dark side to help him, nor allow himself to be provoked into a fury. This is why he was overpowered by Anakin when the Chosen One started tapping into it. Anakin literally just battered him into submission with the dark side. Now, Dooku and Mace are pretty close to equals, but where Dooku can win where his master can't is in his mindset. Mace will have nothing to feed his loop with, and must fight Dooku with his own base power alone. Our second pick is also linked to Sidious on the opposite end of the hierarchy, and that is his master Darth Plagueis. Let's put cards on the table here. Plagueis is perfectly capable of losing his rag and cutting loose with the full fury of the dark side behind him. But it is important to note the context of that little hissy fit. Now, Plagueis was caught completely off guard, essentially with his pants down. Had just witnessed his oldest friend executed by Maladian assassins, and believe it or not, Sith can care about other people. They just care about themselves more. He was also then set upon by said assassins who outnumbered him significantly, and were some of the most deadly assassins in the galaxy, sometimes employed to kill Jedi. And finally, he could not bring his lightsaber to bear, necessitating the use of the Force and his bare hands against fully armed opponents. Now, I think it's fair to say that anyone might fight with the fury of a caged animal when the deck is so unfairly stacked against them in this manner. But we also have another confrontation to draw speculation from, and that is the only lightsaber duel Plagueis was ever depicted taking part in, fighting a potential usurper who was not only just as good as him with a lightsaber, but actually better. Now, we only have Plagueis' POV perspective on the fight, but we do have enough information to paint a picture and speculate with a decent degree of accuracy as to how Plagueis conducts himself in a lightsaber duel. So, he was bored and found the fight tedious. He was thinking carefully about all factors affecting the duel while simultaneously fighting a better opponent, and he was able to take himself out of his body and puppet it with the Force while he figured out a strategy. This to me doesn't paint the picture of someone releasing themselves into the dark side and unleashing their fury. This is the mindset of a calm and cerebral fighter, one who thinks carefully and remains level-headed, and once again starves the Vaapad loop of what it needs to get going. Now, do I think Plagueis can win? I have to be honest, I'm not sure. He's a lightsaber master, but without further accolades, that kind of just means you've mastered your chosen forms. I mean, the 3 Jedi Mace took with him to face Sidious were lightsaber masters, and, well...
I played it, mate.
But we should consider that Sidious didn't want to fight Plagueis directly, so the moon may have been much better than we are led to believe. And again, like Dooku, Plagueis has a chance because he can avoid the blind fury that consumes most Sith. And even if he did throw his toys out of the pram and start going balls to the wall, Plagueis is a thinker. He's one of the few Sith with a scientific view of the Force. He'd likely deduce what is happening and back off to regroup. Not super confident Plagueis could take Mace out though. He's not one for combat like Dooku, but he can definitely still handle himself. What do you guys think? Let us know down in those comments. And our third pick before we yield the floor to you guys? Well, as we previously said, Darth Bane would certainly be a slave to the loop. Orbilis-covered Bane, forget about it. But what about his apprentice? Now, this one is likely the most controversial, as Darth Zanna kind of needs to call heavily on the dark side in order to do anything useful combatively. But she doesn't need to call on her raw anger and hatred to cross sabers. Zanna was slight, physically frail, and possessed very little aptitude for physical combat, or a warrior spirit in general really. She was a trickster, one who relied on misdirection and toying with the mind of her opponent through Sith sorcery. As a duelist, Zanna was trained to do one thing, and one thing only: defend herself. Now, this all comes down to how you interpret how Vaapad works. Do you believe that Mace feeds off of the dark side itself being called upon? Essentially the ambient energy that permeates around Sith when they tap into it? Or do you believe he can only channel the power that is literally thrown his way through the opponent's channeling of emotions that are amped by the dark side? I'm inclined to believe Mace can only redirect the energy that is channeled directly at him. Otherwise, it wouldn't be too far of a stretch to say that Mace just plain old uses the dark side, which doesn't make sense. Unless Mace lied to everyone about the dark side not touching him. Out of our 3 picks though, even if Zanna can nullify Mace's trick, I doubt she actually has the skill to take Mace mano a mano. Her spells and illusions aren't likely to affect him, as he's quite literally the Jedi's embodiment of headstrong. She'll either end up stonewalling him until he pushes through her defenses, or she might be lucky enough to hold him off long enough to escape. Do you think she's got it? Let us know down in those comments, guys. And I know we said we'd yield the floor to you guys, but we have one more honorable mention and then you guys can throw in your suggestions. And that is another Sith linked to Sidious, his final apprentice, Darth Vader. Now, Vader is a tricky one because he has inconsistent showings in his mentality, which actually makes him one of the more realistic fighters. One minute he's calm and ruthless like Dooku, using psychological warfare and the environment to his advantage, and the next he's a furious berserker who will stop at nothing to cut you down in blinding rage. And now we yield the floor to you guys. Can you think of any Sith that can counter Vaapad and force Mace into a fair 1v1? Remember, this is not a discussion of who could win against Mace, but which Darksiders can overcome his unique tricks. Let us know your thoughts down below, guys. We love the discussion. And that's our take. What did we get right, what did we miss, and what did we get wrong? I'm sure you'll have no problem telling us. Thanks for watching, guys.